Hello folks, hope that you're having a good and safe day today. Today I want to take a look back at Guy de Maupassant. He is a writer I've looked at once before for his short story, The Horla. I've picked up this collection called The Horla and Others, which is a collection of his better supernatural work. This is a guy who was heavily prolific during his era. He wrote tons and tons of stuff. And even though he died in his 40s, he still had like just a massive amount of stories out there. So a lot of things out there that write, and we'll put together some of his things. We'll always have it with like sort of a best of approach, and this one has that sort of a best of sort of style. The name of the story that we're going to be taking a look at today is He with a question mark, like he, is going to be the story that we're looking at. Take a look at it here. It's 6 pages in my collection. Like a lot of Guy's stuff, it's incredibly short. He tends to be, compared by modern standards, more of a writer of flash fiction with 4, 5, 6 page stories, the common phenomenon. And even his longer works to be shorter compared to other people's longer works. I mean, his longer stuff's like 20 pages. His epic works are in the 20s, which is good in case you're interested in picking up a Guy de Maupassant collection or reading his stuff. Now, obviously, he is somebody who's been canonized in American canon. His translations of his stories are in English textbooks, reading textbooks, literature textbooks that you've read. So you've read a lot of his things. And the problem is that, and this is the second time I've reviewed a story. The first story I did for you was The Horla, a horror story. It's one of his best stories ever. It's one of his highest rated stories ever. And it's a horror story that he did when he was living in an asylum. For the last year and a half, 2 years of his life, he wrote a lot of horror stuff. Although he would write the occasional horror story beforehand. So what I want to do is to start taking a deep dive into sort of the horror side of Guy for you. Using this collection as a guide, I'm going to take a look at the occasional story in it to kind of take a deep dive for you. One of the things I'm passionate about this channel is providing the context of who writers were, and what they actually were doing. The problem is that we have oftentimes, as modern audiences, we've anesthetized people from whom they actually were. Jack London is an example I'm very passionate about. We oftentimes will just go and read a Jack London short story, or a book or novel like Call the Wild, White Fang, something like that, without realizing he's a dyed-in-the-wool socialist and that he was the first person to write modern dystopian stories, and that he used his socialist views as a part of that, and that also that he was a science fiction writer. He was writing post-apocalyptic works. He was writing set 100 years in the future. He's writing dystopian works set in the future. He's a science fiction writer too, but we don't approach him as that. We've removed his science fiction context. We've removed his socialist contexts. We're only reading, the books that you're supposed to read as a child, and then that's it. As an American, and that includes Jack London's Call the Wild, and then that's it. You move on, right? We're not teaching who he is. We're not explaining who he is. We've removed that context from him. But he's a science fiction writer, and it's important, and a socialist, and it's important to understand those two aspects of who he is. Well, Guy de Maupassant is somebody who's also oftentimes removed. For example, I have this collection of him that I read when I was in college, and it collects all of his best stuff. It's this big, thick, giant tome, and as you can expect for a work that's this bit thick, for a guy who doesn't write stories very long, it has a ton of his best stories in it. Now, I've read that thing from cover to cover when I was in college. Only one horror story, The Horla, is in it, which is oftentimes seen as the one you have to publish because of how good it is and how high quality it is. But that's it. There's no other horror stories in there. They have removed, if you will, except with the token The Horla, the idea of him as a horror writer, even though he was very passionate about writing horror stories and tropes and so forth. He loved Poe. He loved trying to put Poe into his works. He also loved Europeans that were copying Poe. He also would use those in some of his works too, and you're actually going to see that with He here in a moment. So we're going to take a look at one of those things. Again, I think people have removed the horror-loving and writing aspects of Guy de Maupassant from himself. You don't see it in his collections. You don't see it in his works. So but he wrote a lot of short stories in that genre. So we're going to take a look at a few of those short stories that are available. I'll link you to them and such below. So now we're going to move on to He. He is the first time I've done a short story for you that kind of will have his misogyny definitely out there. There are some works that he has done as massively misogynistic. This one is less so, but it's still there. He is somebody who's very, very anti-woman, and you can definitely get a feel for that in his stories. That'll happen in this story too. Although it's a lesser part of the story, it's still a part of the story. And a lot of his stories will involve women who are mean, nasty, cheating, those sorts of things. We'll have a lot of those sort of aspects to his thing. But he is definitely influenced by Poe. And so you can definitely see that the Poetic style of influence, he goes in a different direction than a Poe story might, but it's interesting. So we'll take a look at it real quick for you. In my collection, it's 5.5 pages long, which is a very short story. I read it this morning. It took a very, very short period of time. But one of the things, basically, on the first page, you're going to be introduced to this character who is so anti-woman, he believes that 9 out of 10 marriages have the husband being a cuckold without realizing it. He'll say that on the first page, because women are so constantly cheating on husbands. And he believes that marriage was never going to be for him. He wants to woo 1,000 women. He doesn't want to be and leave them. He doesn't want to be the one who ever commits to one and so forth. But he's about ready to marry the most normal of women, the one who's designed to marry people, that middle class woman who's designed to marry people, and so forth. And why is he settling? You're going to find out on page 2, because he's afraid of the dark and the nighttime. And then you'll find out for the rest of the short story why he's afraid of the nighttime. And so again, you get that sort of anti-woman feel on the first page with the narrator. Although you can pass it off as the narrator, him thinking that women cheat on people. There's this cynical view of women. But it's not just true in this story. You're going to see it in many other stories too, like in The Hand. You see it from Guy, which is also a short story where women can't take knowing about special certain murderous things or ghostly things, or else they'll faint, they'll panic, and so forth. And so it's right for men to keep those things from those silly little women. You'll see, and that's the key part of the story. You'll see that as in some of his other works too. And some are much bigger than others. But again, here I think the key idea of needing to marry somebody, even though you didn't expect to get married, and because you're afraid of the night and being by yourself, is, I think, a very interesting and compelling fear. And I think that he does a good job with it. He's Guy de Maupassant. He's a big name writer for a reason, right? And so you can be very satisfied, I think, with the conclusion that he draws upon. Now, you're also going to find out that as he writes, and as you read more of his stuff, the ones that you're probably used to reading are the surprise ending ones. Not all of his stories actually have are a surprise in the last paragraph or something like that. Like The Necklace, for example, is famous because, spoiler alert in case you haven't read The Necklace, but I'm sure everybody has, because the person who was borrowed the necklace, it was just costume jewelry, but she thought that it was a real necklace that she had lost. So she had spent a lot of money, a lot of her time, a lot of her effort tracking down the actual necklace and having it made, because she thought that it was a real one, only to find out at the end it was actually just costume jewelry that she had lost, and it wasn't worth anything. That sort of a surprise ending is exactly what he's known for with a lot of his appearances. But not all of his stories have this sort of surprise ending. They build up to it. They have some other stuff happening. And that, I think, keeps you fresh as a reader of Guy de Maupassant, because you know that it's not going to be in all of the stories. Only in the stories that have earned it, only in the stories that have where it's an important part of the story does he do that. The Horla, for example, which is my favorite story that he wrote, and since I reviewed it for you, I'll actually link it to you below. But The Horla is a great example of how he doesn't have a surprise ending, but he builds up to it over time. He has what's happening. You're going to learn earlier than the last page, but it's dark, it's deep, and it's depressing in how much it's going to affect mankind. So anyway, I'll go ahead and leave you to he. Have you read it? Let me know what you think about it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please feel encouraged to hit that subscribe button. There's going to be so many more reviews of horror like this, science fiction, and fantasy for y'all. I try to find some classics and some people that you may have heard about, or things that you may not, or that have been forgotten to time, and bring them up here as a part of my channel. And finally, I just want to thank you for taking some time out of your day and watching the video. We all have so many things happening in our lives, and we're pulled in so many different directions. So the fact that you spent this time with me, that's so humbling, and I really do appreciate that. Thanks again, and have a good one.